Every culture tells a story about itself, just the way individuals tell stories about themselves. In the case of cultures, the story they tell answers three questions. Who am I? What's the world all about? And how do I connect with the world? That story constitutes the spiritual capital of that culture. Social scientists have been using concepts like human capital and social capital for the past couple of decades. And let me start with social capital, then it makes it easier to explain what spiritual capital is. By social capital, what they mean are the networks of beliefs and practices, et cetera, that hold people together. Certain kinds of social capital actually make it possible for people to function better, and if you're lacking social capital, that generally tends to explain why you're dysfunctional. The tendency has been to look at spiritual capital as a subset of social capital, namely the practices and beliefs of various religious organizations. I would tend to want to put the relationship somewhat differently. I would want to say that the way in which we understand human beings is not so much in terms of structure, but in terms of meaning. So if you want to understand what a person is or what a culture is, you have to understand how they themselves think about what they're doing. So to the extent that people have spiritual capital, or they're aware of it or self-conscious, they tend to know who they are, how they relate to the rest of the world. From that point of view, I would want to say that spiritual capital is really the most fundamental kind of capital. And social capital might be a subset of that rather than the other way around. The Judeo-Christian heritage is most certainly America's spiritual capital. I would actually argue that it's better to characterize it as the Judeo-Christian inheritance rather than Judeo-Christian tradition. The distinction being that most people use the term tradition in some rigid sense, whereas I think the notion of inheritance connects better with capital. Inheritance is obviously something that somebody else gives to you, but what you do with it pretty much depends on how you've appropriated it, how you want to develop it. And of course, an inheritance is also something that you can fritter away, something you can contribute to, and something that you can develop in new directions. But you have to begin with something. And I think in order to understand American culture, you cannot ignore the most important historical fact, which is that America's spiritual capital is the Judeo-Christian inheritance.